Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second session of Learning DITA Live 2019. I'm Alan Pringle of Scriptorium, and I will be moderating this session. This session is DITA Right for Me by John Baker of EasyDITA. Learning DITA Live is brought to you by Scriptorium, the content strategy experts. Since 1997, Scriptorium has helped companies manage, structure, organize, and distribute content in an efficient way. If you are trying to figure out how the DITA model can best support your content, or you are setting up a new DITA system, please contact us. We would love to help you. LearningDITA.com and Learning DITA Live would not be possible without the help from our sponsors. And I would like to point out that EasyDITA is a sponsor, and we thank them very much for their support. Just want to go over briefly how the session is going to work. During the webcast, all attendees are muted. Even so, we still want your input during the session. Please type your questions and comments at any time during the session into the questions module, and the speaker will answer your questions at the end of the session. So if you would, take the time to locate that questions module in the GoToWebinar interface now. And at the beginning of the question and answer phase, please look for a link to a session evaluation survey, and we'll drop that into the questions module. We very much appreciate your feedback on these sessions. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to John. John, are you there?
Yes, Alan, I'm here. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing pretty well.
Great.
Up here in snowy Rochester. It's a little bit chilly.
Well, let me hand over things to you so you can start presenting. Okay. And there you go.
All right. Just make sure I have everything set up over here. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to this presentation on Is DITA Right for Me? My name is John Baker, and I'm the Content Marketing Manager for EasyDITA. Just a little bit about myself, really quick. In my role as the Content Marketing Manager, I'm always trying to explore better ways to communicate these technical concepts in understandable ways to people who are interested. And so, to this end, I spend a lot of time creating resources, things like articles, webinars, video content, white papers, case studies, essentially whatever tool will do the trick for these instances. I also find that oftentimes in this role, I'm trying to bridge this communication gap that can kind of exist between technical writers and the managers at the top, where it seems like they actually might have interests that are aligned, but they might not be speaking the exact same language. So I spend a lot of time trying to create resources that help bridge that gap. Outside of work, I stay pretty busy. I'm a pretty passionate hobbyist photographer. I've always got a camera in my backpack or in my car. I have a terrible habit of buying far too many books, but I do a pretty good job of reading most of those books. So my wife doesn't give me too much trouble. I'm also a big Tottenham Hotspur soccer fan. Had a pretty rough loss over the weekend. That was a little bit painful, but it's been a great season overall. And just most of all, I love spending time with my wife and my 3 kids. Actually, today we've had some high-speed wind gusts. I think they've been reaching like 75 miles an hour. So instead of going into the office, I'm actually working out of the house. So I've got all my kids upstairs reading quietly in their bedrooms, and they've been promised that they get a cookie if they're able to be quiet for the extent of this webinar. So a little bit about EasyDITA. EasyDITA is a start-to-finish content management system in which you can author your DITA content, you can manage it through a component content management system, and then you can publish it on the end. And it really is powerful in a way that makes DITA usable for people who might not be as familiar with it, try to get the entire company to be able to use this tool and publish documents on the other side. So without further ado, let's dive in. So there's a lot of content I want to go over today, so we're going to be going through things pretty quickly. But we're going to start out by talking about DITA and structured content as a whole. I know Gretel just did a terrific presentation on the nuts and bolts and all the technical aspects of DITA. So rather than dive back into all those technical aspects of it, we're just going to do a quick kind of overview and use a little bit of analogy to understand why it's relevant to your entire company. Then we're going to take some time and look at the problems facing technical writers and companies as a whole. And the reason why we're going to do that is because a lot of times when people talk about DITA, they talk about the advantages available or the things that it can add to a company because they aren't totally aware of some of the broken systems that currently exist in the company and how DITA can actually fix these points of which we're bleeding in a sense. From there, we're going to look at some of the solutions to those problems. And then we're going to take a look at some of the considerations that organizations and teams need to look at before making the dive into DITA. Finally, we're going to talk about company-wide value, some unique applications, and we're going to look at company collaboration and what things we believe at EasyDITA are important to have a company be able to collaborate within a shared tool. All right, so let's dive in. What is DITA? Well, just a quick background around the 1960s. I'm sure a lot of people already know this, or maybe a lot of people don't necessarily care about the history so much. But it started back in the 1960s with a standard generalized markup language, and that was just intended to give humans and computers this framework to be able to interface. As time went on, that branched out, and you had HTML off to one side and a lot of web applications and ways you can get content interpreted on the internet. And over on the other side, there's these XML languages, these extensible markup languages that developed: Prism, JATS, DocBook, and DITA. Now, DITA was developed specifically for publishing output, and that's why it was so well received by technical writers in that community. But why do we need these XMLs in the first place? Well, at a fundamental level, it's all about language. As humans, we've evolved over all this time to be able to communicate really nuanced things through these grunts or these words and these written characters that we have. But the human language is so flexible and it's so nuanced and it's so powerful. But as a direct result, it's also terrible for interfacing with computer systems. So this is where XML came into place, or came into the picture as a method for communicating between humans and computers. Now, I'm going to tell a quick story about when I recently decided to build a bookshelf. I ordered it online through an online retailer who will go unmentioned. It arrived 2 days later in this small yet incredibly heavy box. I dumped out all the parts, all the materials onto the floor, found lots of boards, screws, 17 different Allen wrenches for some reason. And, you know, being a man, I was like, okay, I got this. I'm just going to throw it together, see what happens. I glanced at it. I arranged everything in an organized manner. I even looked at the instruction manual, maybe not as much as I should have, but I looked at it. I got a general idea for how this should look, and I started putting it together. But there's a problem I ran into, and I realized that some of these boards were very similar, but I couldn't distinguish exactly which one should be used where. So the ones at the top and the bottom differed slightly, just the direction of the pilot holes. And rather than taking some time to make sure I was using the right ones, I just threw it all together. And as you could guess, it didn't work. So I had to take everything apart and start from the beginning. So what I missed was the fact that there were these little stickers on in the instructions that told me how to cross-reference which pieces of the board should be used in which situations. So when I went back, took it apart, paid attention to these stickers, I was able to build this relatively sturdy bookshelf. So how does this relate to DITA? Well, let's say in the same way that we want to publish a PDF. In the same way that I had this pile of materials, your computer has this pile of content. Now your computer can in some ways kind of parse out a general idea for how this should look. But when it comes down to it, when people author in different ways, there are slight variations. Maybe it's about the way it indicates the title text or ordered list versus tasks, things of that nature. There are differences in the way people would naturally write these things. So a computer, in the same way that I need instructions, the computer needs an XML standard. That XML standard tells the computer how to use each piece of content when creating this output. But the computer has the same issue that I had. In the same way that I needed that sticker to be able to cross-reference which piece should be used how, your computer needs these semantic tags in order to understand what to do with these different pieces of content. So with these tags, when everything is aligned properly, your computer is able to take your content, the raw materials, understand how it should be used through the XML standard that serve like instructions, and cross-references your content with the semantic tags with how you should treat it. And as a result, ta-da, you can publish your PDF. So this is important from your company's perspective, because it's not, when you just talk about semantic tags or when you just talk about DITA XML, I know a lot of eyes tend to glaze over and people might not actually care, and that's because they don't understand how fundamentally different DITA is in this context than an unstructured document. An unstructured document, it's difficult for a computer to know what to do with it. When you break that down and you have these modular concepts, task, and reference topics, then you can use those and arrange them in different formations to create various manuals, different types of outputs. You've essentially invested in creating the building blocks for your other documents on the other side. So why does this matter to your company? Quite simply, there's a lot of advantages to it. Now we're just going to breeze through this really quickly, but there's the power of automation. If your content is unstructured, it's very difficult for, like we talked about, this computer interfacing to be able to work with it. But there are significant advantages to having things broken up into this modular method. Things like publishing the output, the formatting, the publishing, things like that can become automated. It's future-proofed in a sense. Rather than having a proprietary system that's sort of locked down and a little bit out of your control, DITA as an open standard is something that's controlled by community, not the whims of one individual company. There's also time and cost savings. This is one of the big ones. And sometimes it's just a matter of being able to translate or to inform individuals how that time and cost savings can be realized through a DITA implementation. There are also exciting new technologies. Now, I know it seems like there's always some new technology around the bend. We joke a little bit about chatbots as, you know, everyone's all of a sudden got to have a chatbot or something of that nature. But these are the kind of questions that keep managers up at night. They are trying to understand which new technologies they should prepare for, which ones they should implement. And the knowledge that through having a DITA content or having your content in a DITA format, it really opens the door to these exciting new technologies, and you are prepared for new advances that might come down the line in a way that unstructured doesn't prep you for. Also, killing knowledge gaps. When we talk about things that keep a manager up at night, knowledge gaps is one of the big ones. And that essentially just means knowing that there's information that's not being properly disseminated through the company. And then finally, that long-term investment. This is a huge one for the company. There's the power of having this content that's ready to use today, but you're also going to be reaping benefits for years to come when it's properly set up. So let's talk about the problem, or as I call it, the opportunity cost of doing nothing. If you're still in an unstructured content system and you're not going to move to DITA, then this is the opportunity cost that you're looking at. So what's the problem in the modern company? It's that there's content demands that are always increasing, but the capacity rarely keeps up. I hear this story all the time, whether I'm at a conference or I'm just talking with other tech writers. There's this understanding that what they're expected to create, there's always higher expectations, but the tools they're given or the resources or the budget allocation, it never seems to keep up with it. So why is this? Well, there's two primary reasons that we've identified, and there's a lot of other ones, but these are two of the ones I want to focus on. The first is complexity. Now, I know there's always the discussion of complexity, how does this manifest? But in so many respects, the world is just becoming increasingly complex. If you talk to my grandfather and ask him about car repair, he'll tell you about the good old days when he had a 1957 Chevy Bel Air. You could pop the hood, you could see the engine, and you could intuitively understand some basic mechanics of it. It would take a little bit of elbow grease, it would take some work. You might have to ask a friend. But there was an ability to be able to see it, learn about it, and interact with it. Whereas now, you pop the hood and he'll say, you know, you need a computer to diagnose half the issues that modern vehicles have. And so this is especially true in the tech comm world, where we see that products have become increasingly complex. The authoring tools that they're expected to use have become increasingly complex. And simply the output expectations. You can't just put it out in a PDF anymore. There's so many other formats that companies feel they need to publish to in order to keep up with the competition. There's a quote I really love from the computer scientist, Dijkstra, that says, "Simplicity is a great virtue, but it requires hard work to achieve it and education to appreciate it. And to make matters worse, complexity sells better." That quote just gets me in the gut because it tells such a truth of human nature, and that we do have this sort of cognitive bias towards complexity, of that when you're faced with two options, the complex versus the simple, we just intuitively tend to think a lot of times, well, I've got to go with the complex one. And so as a result of that, we've just seen over time this ever increasing complexity, and I don't think it's going to stop anytime soon. So what's the next aspect? Well, the next one is product or production growth. And just simply put, successful companies tend to expand. That's a symptom of this capitalistic marketplace, is that the successful companies expand, they grow, and they continue. And so this means that there's growth in the product breadth, product depth, and the geographic reach of these products. So when you take all that together, you end up multiplying the factors of complexity by the factors of production growth. And that explains why there's always this increase in capacity, but there isn't necessarily the increase in resources. So what does this mean for the writers? Well, we've split it up in this conversation. We're going to go through these pretty quick, but we're going to look at from how it relates to the authoring perspective, or how it relates to authoring content, managing content, publishing content, and scaling content. So first off, let's look at authoring. So what is one of the big problems with authoring in the modern organization? There's the matter of consistency between documents. So how do companies try to remedy this? To offset this, they end up spending all this time, energy, effort, resources on training, reviews, revisions, things of that nature. We did a recent survey here with about 150 tech writers, and we found that the average respondent spends about 11 hours a week just updating and maintaining their existing documentation. That's not creating anything new. That's just working on the things that have already been addressed. And we also found that writers generally considered that work to be one of their less fruitful or less valuable tasks as it related to the company. Also with authoring, we find that there's the big issue of duplicate content that has to be rewritten or copy and pasted. This might be because there's similar content between different products, and so you have to take that content and move it from one product manual to another. Excuse me. Or in some cases, there's exact content, but you have to spend time trying to disentangle it from the surrounding content. And so this becomes a significant amount of time. We actually found in that survey that the average writer reported that they spend about 3 hours a week just copying and pasting content. And then that was always considered their least fruitful or least valuable activity, something that writers just really did not enjoy. Moving over to managing. So we see that for a lot of organizations, when it comes to managing content, this issue, the dreaded silo effect or the siloed information. This is one of the big ones, and this is one that when you look at company surveys, it's recognized as a huge problem from top to bottom. There was actually a recent survey out of Econsultancy that said that 40% of companies report department silos. And the language that they used in that survey was actually pretty jarring. Some of them said that, I think they used the term of they felt like other departments almost had an agenda that just didn't agree with theirs, or something to that effect, where it sounded almost adversarial. And that's a little bit scary if you have a company where you want everyone to be on the same page, driving towards the same goal. This notion that different organizations have different agendas, that's a little bit of a startling one. And so there's that problem of having a siloed information that not everyone can get access to. I think a good example of this is, say you're working on a report, it's due by Friday, and you need some information. You ask around, where can I find this? Someone tells you, oh, it's on, Frank's got it. So you try to find Frank. Well, Frank took an early weekend, and so he's out. So you don't have access to this information. There's nowhere else you can get it. Just situations like that where it's simply inaccessible to you. Another aspect of managing is that sometimes this content is simply hard to find. That might be because it's stored in documents and you might not know the exact title of the documents. At a previous company I worked for, I can't tell you how much time was spent with me just looking at our shared cloud drive and just trying to pick through and find the name of a document that might relate to the content I was trying to find. And just incredible amounts of time was wasted on that. There's a recent survey out of McKinsey that found that interaction workers spent 19% of their time searching for existing content. That is a staggering number. Almost a fifth of their day was searching not for new content, but searching for content that was already created by their organization. That's really inefficient, and it speaks to the problem that we have right now in a lot of organizations with siloed content, inaccessible content, or content that is difficult to find. Also relating to managing, the versioning nightmare. Now I know this was addressed a little bit in the previous session, and this goes into the importance of having some sort of content system in place. At EasyDita, we have a component, or we offer a component content management system. But at my old job, I was always asking this question: what is the latest version? I would go around, I would have multiple versions of the same document, and I would try to figure out which one was actually the latest version, because they'd all be titled something different. And you may relate to the story. It starts out as a single document, and you think, okay, I want to get some reviews, so you send it out, you want some other people to look at it. And so as far as you know, it's gone to 2 other people, and you're hoping they'll send you back their reviews, their revisions, and you can reconcile those, and it won't be too hard. Maybe you've printed off a PDF and they're marking it up with a red pen or something like that. But unbeknownst to you, they might have sent it out. Maybe they reconciled it themselves, but then they also sent another version to their supervisor. Maybe that individual then sent one out to a couple other members in the company, or it might have gone back to the original. And before you know it, you're left on the other side asking, what's the final version? And the answer is, I don't know, because all of these versions probably have useful information that could be added or reconciled to the final. But this is just an example of that versioning nightmare that so many people can relate to. All right. So another one of these big problems, and I'm not going to spend too much time on the publishing side because I know that's going to be addressed in some other sessions when it comes to DITA. This is one of the central aspects of the advantage of DITA, is how it optimizes your publishing work through. But when it comes to unstructured, there's so much time that's spent on inconsistent styling and trying to make that look good. I know, coming from a company that had very rigid brand guidelines, how much time was spent just trying to, push things around, adjust the margins, tweak this, tweak that, and it becomes very frustrating when you spend so much of your time doing that. In our survey, we actually found that writers considered that formatting and styling their second least valuable activity. Yet they ended up spending a significant chunk of their week working on this activity. Another aspect of the publishing is that you have all these different duplicates for each audience type. So that ends up multiplying the amount of effort that you have to put in. And so when you have to adjust everything for different audience types, you have to multiply by a factor of however many audience members there are that you're trying to adjust for. For Microsoft Office users in particular, there was a recent study from, I think it was 2015, that found that 30 to 50% of the document creation time was just spent on publishing formatting. That is a dramatic amount of time. And then when you take that and you scale that out to however many instances of document creation there are, you just end up with incredible amounts of time, effort, and money left on the table. So now we're going to jump over to scaling. Now, I know I heard everybody's eyes roll a little bit there. When we talk about scaling, it is business jargon, and I'm sorry to even have to use this term, but sometimes jargon is helpful because at least we all know what we're talking about. So in this case, when we say scaling, we're talking about your content's ability to grow with your organization. One of the most prominent ways that we see the problem of scaling with unstructured content is that it's costly to take care of translation and localization matters. It's one of the top expenses for a lot of organizations when they're looking to expand to new markets. And a lot of times they don't know that there is even a better way to handle things. Another problem with scaling is simply preparing for the future. And I know that sounds a little bit ambiguous, and that's because it's the future and we're always trying to figure it out. We're always trying to predict to the best of our ability. But proprietary systems do not help you do that. When you use an unstructured or proprietary system, you are in many ways at the whims of whatever system you're using. We like to say that there's no API for a Word document, and that's just to say that for a lot of these organizations, they want to be able to jump on the latest, greatest technology, but they're hindered by the way their content is set up. There's actually the 2018 survey from DCL, or DC Labs, that said, when surveyed, almost 50% of organizations reported that their content is not ready to support future plans. Now, I read that, and that was startling, and then I read it again, and it was even more startling because I realized they were not saying that it's not ready to support the future unknown. These were future plans. These were things that these organizations intended to do, and their content was not ready for that. So that's not even to speak of the unknown of the future, the things we don't see coming down the pike yet. So what's the solution? How can DITA come in and add some value to these situations? So we're going to jump back to authoring. When we talk about that consistency between documents. Now, what that basically means is that when you're properly trained for DITA writing, you're writing in a context-free manner. So you're avoiding things like saying in the previous chapter or anything that might be associated with surrounding content. When your team is properly trained and they're writing in a topic-based manner, then they're creating these modular chunks of content that can be rearranged, switched around, and it makes it much more streamlined in order to have more value out of your content because you're writing in a manner that is already set up for modular reuse in all these different situations. So let's talk about that reuse. Now, this is one of the most exciting aspects of DITA, and this is one that I get really excited when I'm talking to other people about, because when you hear about the copy paste, the duplicate content and effort, and you just want to tell them there's a better way with DITA through content reuse. There's a recent book published by Mark Lewis, I believe, called DITA Metrics 101. And in it, he did a great job of just breaking down, he looked at the amount of time it took to create unstructured topic equivalents versus a DITA-based topic, and then looked at how that affected the trajectory of time spent on this content. And so here's a little a scale from that. You'll see the blue line is time spent writing unstructured sections versus the yellow one is time spent writing with DITA topics. And you see there by the fourth instance of reuse, you're saving almost over 50% by that time. So you'll see the yellow line, there's an initial cost. It does take a little bit longer to create a piece of a DITA topic versus an unstructured section. But even by that first time you get to reuse it, you've already flipped the script and you already are seeing savings in ROI. So he uses the example of a cell phone manufacturer that has 3 or 4 different models that are very similar. And so maybe 80% of that instruction manual is the same. And so in no time, these organizations are able to save incredible amounts of time, money, and effort, as opposed to trying to rewrite or copy paste, which becomes a nightmare to manage on the other side. So jumping over to the managing. Okay, when we talk about this, and this is specifically for when you implement some sort of content management, central content management system. Like I mentioned, EasyDITA is a component content management system. And when you have that associated with your DITA, there's the power of centralized knowledge. You are single sourcing your knowledge assets. And this is a powerful thing. We'll talk a little bit more about single sourcing in a moment, but it increases the impact of everything you write. When there's a single source, there's that central authority, that central repository that everybody knows is the standard by which the rest of the company should reference when they're trying to find information about the product. So when you write things for that single source, it increases the impact of it because it automatically, to use a layman's term, in a sense, it becomes canon. It's part of the story of your organization. It's not just a document out there on its own. It's central, it becomes foundational to your company. So it increases the impact. It also increases the efficiency with which you and the rest of the organization can use that content. Now also for managing, The findability. Remember how I said that 20% of time for interaction workers was spent just trying to find the content that they already knew about? Well, if you have a properly managed single source with DITA, you can also use metadata to tag content for easy searching. We like to say that you want your search to look like Amazon, not like Google. That's not to disparage Google. Obviously, Google has done pretty well in terms of the searching landscape. But the difference is that if you know exactly what you're looking for and you know different factors about it, Amazon is a better way to find that type of thing. If you do a search, you'll notice on the left-hand side, you can actually search by, if you want a new toaster, but you want something that is in the colors of silver and red, and you want something that has at least 4-star product review, and you want something that fits in your budget of $25 to $70, and you want it from one of 3 companies, there are options to select all of those things on the side. And so you can do a much more specific targeted search. In the same way, EasyData and other component content management systems let you enhance your searchability of your single source through the inclusion of metadata. So you can tag your topics with things like the workflow status, the review status, the date range for which it was created. You can have specific custom tags created for it. There's so many different ways that you can do this so that you can make your searching process much easier, much more efficient. And finally, for the managing, the versioning questions, those are eliminated. So with the single source, DITA content can be tagged for multiple conditions, so there's no need to maintain multiple versions. You have a single source, and it is the authority, and rather than people taking a document and emailing it to someone else and printing it out and writing on it, and then you're trying to figure out which is the final version. You know that the version in that single source where everyone is doing their work, that is the final version. That is the answer to what's the latest version. It's right there. So all those questions are just eliminated if it's properly managed in your component content management system. Now, moving over, we're going to talk about publishing real quick. So with publishing through DITA, you have consistent styling, and that is because your publishing output is preset, its configuration, it takes some upfront cost and investment to set up, but once it is, you have consistent automatic output. The more you publish, the more you saved. I mentioned earlier a little bit about the time that was spent when you're publishing for multiple audience types. Well, in a DITA-based system, you can actually tag different documents for different conditionalizations or for different audience types, so that you might have the same map, but you have different topics that are tagged for different audience types. So rather than having multiple different versions that you have to set up multiple different publishing outputs for, you can have one map and have different topics within it tagged for different audience types. And then you have that automatic published output that saves you all the time, all the formatting cost. It becomes as simple as a push button publishing. Once that styling is configured, it no longer costs all that time and money. Now, moving over to the scaling. You save when you translate. This is one of the big advantages of a DITA-based system, is that you save on that formatting cost for publishing with your existing publishing configuration. And the more you translate, the more you save. So DITA allows translation memory, so you don't pay for duplicate content or old content that's already translated. If you have a system that has a really robust use of content reuse, then instead of having to retranslate every time that topic pops up, it'll translate for the first time, and then with translation memory, it'll know that that section has already been translated, so you won't need to pay for it every time it comes back up for translation. All right, and also with scaling, we talked about it being ready for the future. There's no API for Word documents, but when you use a DITA-based system, it's an open standard. It's maintained by the community. It's not left to the whims of a private company. It's API ready. There's a lot of open support, and depending on which system you use, there's just so many creative ways that you can get other systems to integrate with this through APIs and various other methods of extracting content. It's also written for tomorrow, just like what we've been saying. This content is content where you made the investment today, but it's ready to reap benefits for the future. Now, some considerations. We've talked about all the warm fuzzies and all the amazing things you can do with DITA, but there are also some considerations that need to come into play. And there's some things you do need to look at the onset. So implementation time. Now, we've seen in our personal experience, and obviously this varies so much based on company, but a typical DITA implementation can typically take about 3 to 6 months. In some instances, it can take a little bit longer, as much as 6 to 12 months, especially if there are significant customizations or further development work is required. That's a difficult answer, or that's a difficult question to just have answered in a webinar format, because like always, the answer is the dreaded, it depends. But these are some ballpark figures for what we've seen in our experience. Be aware of the productivity dip. I'll explain that in just a moment. Information architecture. I know that was touched on really briefly. It should be your first step, even before you select your tool. There should be, your company should have time to talk about and understand what are our expectations going forward, what do we want to accomplish, and how can we set up our content in a way today to prepare for our goals on the other end. So have a clear understanding of how you want that information arranged, developed, and structured. The consideration of training. Now, this is a big one. It's important that trainers are taught to avoid contextual dependency. Things like in the previous chapter, we talked about that a little bit. But if the writers aren't properly trained and they don't really have an understanding for how DITA should be used, you will in effect lose a lot of the benefits of it. So it's very important that writers understand the purpose behind DITA and the way to go about creating content for it. It's also important that there's a consistent tone. Now, this is something that I think is universal for writers. It doesn't really matter what system you're in, but I just say this because if this isn't addressed at the beginning of the process, when you start doing content reuse and you're taking topics that weren't originally associated together and you put them next together, if that tone isn't already established, if it isn't consistent across all your documentations, the difference will be so much more stark. So it's important to understand that and talk about that with your team and have the proper training before you dive in with DITA. Every topic should serve a purpose and fit wherever it's needed. Any two topics, assuming that they are relevant, should be able to fit together and just work. Proper reuse implementation. A lot of organizations will go into DITA without a proper understanding of reuse or a proper planning. And they'll get further down the road and they'll realize they have not really been leveraging all of the advantages that are there with DITA. So that is something where you might need to talk with a consultant and understand how should we plan this? How should we make sure we're getting the best bang for our buck when it comes to reuse within DITA, within a DITA system? Understand the different types of reuse and when to use them. Conref versus a con-key ref versus just all these different instances where you can extract value from that process. Content management. This is just essentially what we've been talking about. There should be training for how to manage your content. There should be the discussion of who controls the system, who has access to what, and make sure, especially if you're using something like a CCMS or a single source, it shouldn't just be open season, everybody has access. You need to have different ways to set restraints and understand how to manage that content. You want to plan and organize. And then finally, this is a no-brainer, but whatever tool you do end up going with, make sure that your writers actually understand how to use the tool. Make sure there's proper training and make sure that everybody is on the same page when it comes to using these tools. So the consideration of content conversion. Again, I know this one was mentioned in the previous section a little bit, but just really quick, there's generally 3 different routes you could take. There's the manual or DIY approach, where sometimes that might mean simply rewriting your content for a DITA method, or it might mean looking at your content and trying to convert it by hand or manually. There are some tools out there. I know they work to varying degrees. And that's really up to the needs of your organization. And then there's finally the conversion vendor, which for a lot of organizations is the right option. And it's just important to understand that with any sort of content conversion, there will be an upfront cost, whether it be time, money, resources. there is an upfront cost that needs to be considered. So just as a ballpark figure, we've actually seen that for a lot of users who want to go from a Word document to DITA, that conversion cost is about $6,000 to $7,000 for the engineering and about $2 to $2.50 per page. And it's just based on some of the interaction we've had with our customers for them moving forward. Also, the question of pre versus post conversion cleanup. I generally hear it recommended that this is, when you're making this discussion, it should be done before. But I know that some talk about doing this sort of conversion cleanup on the other side of the conversion. And you also need to identify the opportunities for reuse. So there's a couple different types where you're looking at exact match. So maybe you see something where it's the exact same content and you use it in multiple locations. Then you know right there, that's an easy topic that you need to reuse. In other instances, it's what we call a fuzzy match. It's a little bit less clear. The content might be very similar, and you'll really have to figure out if that's something where, do you want to turn it to an exact match so that you can easily reuse it? Or is it something that really should stay independent based on your situation? There's also understanding how to arrange your content into different topic types. It's important to understand concept, task, and reference topics and where it's appropriate to use each one and what kind of content should go with each one. So when to consider a consultant? This one is such a personal question, but we do get people asking about it all the time. So what we've typically said is that when you talk about considering a consultant, you should consider working with a DITA consultant if your plan includes highly customized or dynamic publishing outputs, extensive legacy content conversion, streamlined translation process, if you want to implement a streamlined translation process, or complex taxonomy. So those are some of the, sorry, we'll go back to those. Those are some of the factors that often we find lead to it being best to go to a consultation. But again, this is such a personal question, and it's something that every company will need to decide for themselves. The productivity dip, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but when we talk about the productivity dip, this is essentially that during the transition, there's a dip in productivity while the writing team has to adjust to the changes. And we've seen it where sometimes a team will try to, I don't know, breeze over the effect of this productivity dip. And that is a mistake. It's important that with your entire organization, that this is known, this is discussed, there's going to be a change in our ability to put out content for a period, and that you be able to time it appropriately. It should be carefully planned. It should be fully acknowledged. So we see that a lot of these productivity dips happen in conjunction with an increase in required output. So a lot of companies, they know that in the near future, maybe it was an acquisition, maybe it's an expansion to a product line, maybe it's a release time spike, but they know in the near future that more is going to be required of them. And so then we see that there's two kind of ways the team reacts to this. So the first one is the reactive team. This is the team that waited a little bit long. They waited until this required output was right upon them. And then they tried to make the transition to DITA. And you'll see there that there's the yellow line, which stays underneath the required output line for an extended period. And this is because they didn't plan properly. They waited a little bit too long. And so when it did come time for that output to spike up, they were not prepared. They weren't ready. And they eventually were able to get back on top. But that period in there where demands went up and production went down was a very painful one. Whereas on the other side, you have the proactive team. And if they do it right, they communicate with the rest of the organization that there will be this dip while we go and make this DITA implementation. But they do it in a timely manner, and they're able to do it in time for the spike in required output. And as a result, they're able to stay on top of it and come out the other side seen as winners. So company-wide value. I know we're running short on time, so we're going to go through these pretty quickly, but I just want to talk about some creative ways that we've seen DITA for an organization used. So with company-wide value, it's really important to understand that CFOs are listening, CEOs are listening, managers are listening. There was a recent study out of Business Insider that 69% of CFOs said that siloed information was the biggest mistake in modern companies. And we've talked about it a lot. When you have that DITA implementation or that possibility to move over to a single source, whatever your content management system ends up being, at EasyDita, it's a common content management system. But you have that ability to make the case for why you can make your content the foundation of the company and leverage it through a single source. So managers are listening, and there's opportunity here that a lot of companies, we've seen some really creative applications of this where the tech team went from being considered a cost center for the organization to being the heroes in a sense. So it allows for, if you have the proper system, proper workflow in place, it allows a single source for interdepartmental collaboration. Like we've been talking about, if there's a place where everyone knows the absolute truth of that company as it relates to the product documentation, if there's a place for that, a single source, it takes away the questions for everyone else. They know exactly where to look when they need to find information, and they can collaborate much more effectively when everyone is on the same metaphorical page, or the same literal page in this case. There's also the documentation, which can be leveraged for learning and training. This is a really exciting opportunity that some companies have started to see, where they can take their personal documentation and they can turn that into learning and training modules through DITA, and they can make that where they get to almost push the industry and offer their knowledge as a way to shape the direction for everyone else, because they've created it in a way that lets other people learn from what they've been creating. Another example, content reuse for marketing efficiency. This is actually something that we've started experimenting with at EasyDita, and some of our other customers are becoming interested in it. So for our advertising, previously we were using an unstructured system, and we realized that the advantages of DITA, specifically in EasyDita, made it perfect for doing things like maintaining our ad copy. So when you do a lot of display ads, there's a lot of different, very similar variations. And so we started using EasyDita to track those variations and having a single location where we could actually use different tags and track the progress of everything and be able to see what was working and what wasn't. Fast searchable content for immediate customer service value. This is an example that we saw with one of our customers, Allstate actually, where they originally created a centralized repository for internal information, and their team was able to use that to reference instead of making phone calls to their internal support. And when that happened, they saw that the call volume dropped significantly. I think it was about like 25,000 calls a month or something of that nature, just an absolutely tremendous drop in the calls. And so rather all that time being spent taking up internal support, people were able to reference this internal knowledge. They actually then took that idea and created their own chatbot, essentially, where customers can go online and search this repository. And so now customers have access to that single, have access to the information within that single source system. And so there are just a lot of different ways that with the DITA implementation and a proper content management system, the doc team and the technical communication team can actually start to change the way the rest of the company sees content. So now we're going to go through this real quick, and I want to talk about company collaboration because we've talked a lot about how there's value for the rest of the company. And so if you can actually get your entire team using this same tool, that's where you really start seeing tremendous impact from this. So there's a lot of barriers to collaboration that we see today. There's work that's done outside of the tools that are available. There's improper training that we've talked about. There's file locking, so only one person can be using a file at a time, or there's workflow tracking, or rather the lack thereof. These are some of the primary barriers that we see for collaboration. But when you have that single source of truth, you have that central content repository. I know we've talked about this a lot, but you save a significant amount of time searching. That McKinsey report I talked about earlier, if you extrapolate that and you take into consideration average salary, that means that each employee is spending about $10,000 worth of their time just trying to find that information. You can streamline workflows within the single source system, so you understand what what is next in this workflow system and whose turn it is to contribute. You can boost efficiency by writing, editing, and approving documentation in the central single source system. And like we've been talking about, you can control the versioning, prevent documents from multiplying with incorrect versions, and understand what is the final version. So just really quickly, some key aspects of effective collaboration. And these are examples that we've seen when we've tried to make EasyDita better for these organizations. And so these are just a couple of the ways that we designed the authoring system to be perfect for company-wide collaboration, not just the technical writers. So one of the first things is simply a familiar interface. We wanted a system that was familiar, easy to look at, something that anybody could jump in, and maybe they wouldn't know how to do everything, but they wouldn't be intimidated. They would look at it and say, okay, I can work with this system. Change tracking comments. This is an idea that was popularized and a lot of people came to know through Google Docs, where you add a suggestion or a comments and it does the text with the underline in a separate color. So that's a great idea, but it's something where if it's done in an unstructured system, it's not really scalable company-wide. But if you can have that functionality and you have that in your structured content system with DITA, then you really see the benefits of it. That's something that we recently added in EasyDita. Assignments and workflows. Now, as far as I know, this is something that's available in a lot of different systems, but it's still something that's very crucial. So you'll see like down there at the bottom of it, it's a very simple workflow that just author, review, approve. So it'll send out the notification email, the first person in the flow, they go in, they write the content. When they select I'm done, it goes to the next person in line and continues through that review process. So it keeps everyone on the same page, everyone is aware of their assignments, and everyone knows their place in that workflow. And a dedicated review interface. This is one thing that we think is undersold with a lot of systems. It's very important that you are able to have your SMEs using a tool that they'll actually want to use. So this one, for example, has that quick pop out, we call it the review widget, where if you hover over it, it pops out and they can go to the next instance where they're mentioned in a comment, or the next open comment, or the next validation issue. And then finally, real-time collaboration, or another way of saying no file locking. So one of our customers, F5, they actually recently, when they moved to the new version of EasyDita with this real-time simultaneous multi-user collaboration ability, they have over 200 subject matter experts now who can all contribute in these documents simultaneously, and they take full advantage of it. And so that's just another example of a really powerful way you can get your entire organization in using the system together. So now we've gone over all this. We've talked about the pros, the things that we saw as solutions to those problems that exist in the modern company. Things like the topic-based building blocks of content, reuse, single source of truth, metadata, etc. We also took some time and looked at the considerations, the things that you should be aware of before making this jump over to DITA. And so I just hope that through this presentation, you're able to walk away with a little bit more knowledge about whether or not DITA would be the right option for your organization. And maybe the problems that I mentioned, you don't actually see manifesting too much in your organization. Maybe you're all right where you're at, but hopefully through this presentation, you at least know some of the signs to look for. You know whether or not DITA has good options to provide solutions for those instances where you would like to fix something. And you also understand a little bit of the cost on the other end. You know, there's no such thing as a free system. There is a trade-off. There are considerations that need to be made. So here are some of the resources that we often recommend, the bibliography. And we also set up a quick little quiz. So I know you can't actually select this link, but if you go over to easydita.com/isdita-right-for-me, with a hyphen between each word, there's a little quiz that you can take, which kind of goes over all of the ones that all the points that we've talked about through this. So you can go through, you select which items apply to your situation. And at the bottom, it'll give you a recommendation about whether or not DITA might be the best option for you in your current situation. So, all right, and that's the end of my presentation. I want to thank you all so much for your time. I know that we went through a ton of information in too little amount of time, but I thank you all for your patience.
Thank you, John. We do have a few questions, and I'm going to run through a few of them before our time runs out. So let me take control back over, and then I will run through a few of those questions. Okay. DITA is super flexible, but in what environments would you not recommend DITA?
So in what situations would I not recommend DITA? I think a lot of it comes down to in the situations where maybe you don't have a lot of output expectations, or maybe where there are a lot of changes and you don't see a lot of opportunities to reuse your content. Those situations exist out there. If you don't have a lot of products, or you don't have a lot of publishing expectations, or you don't have a lot of opportunities for translation, DITA might not be the best option for you. It's also about the team that you're working with. And so I think, Alan, you might actually have some insight into this as well. But that's what we often see.
You've already used these words, it depends, and it really, really does. You mentioned, the various outputs, that's part of it too. Also, are you a one or two member team? If you're a very small team, don't have a lot of reuse, there's several different factors that can come into whether or not switching to DITA might be right for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I talked about, the move to DITA, it is a significant shift, and it does require, in a lot of ways, an almost a different mindset. So it's not something to go into lightly, but there is a lot of opportunity on the other side. But it is something that needs to be considered.
Absolutely. Here is another question. You said that DITA has been embraced mainly by the technical writing community. Have you seen an implementation where all content creators within a company are using DITA, and that would include tech support, marketing, and so on?
So I'm not sure what I'm allowed to say, but one of our customers right now is exploring that, and I think they're going to be looking for a company-wide implementation in the near future. Right now, the difficulty in the past has been that DITA for a lot of systems it hasn't always been presented in a way that's very user-friendly to, I work in marketing, and I'm going to be honest, for a lot of marketers, we're really shallow people.
You said it, so I didn't.
I know. My friend and I actually, we talk about starting a blog called Marketers Ruin Everything. But there's a reality to the fact of sometimes other departments, they just want something that's easy to use and that works for them. So that's actually one of the big pushes. We've been making it easy DITA. And I think with the latest version that we had is the first one where people outside of the tech writing space look at it and say, oh, I could use this. This makes sense. They don't know a lick of DITA, but they see it and they're like, okay, I see the value here, and this looks like something I could use. So as of right now, we do have one of our customers that is considering making that jump. I would think that there are other organizations out there who do have company-wide use of DITA, but I don't know of them off the top of my head.
It is happening. That is absolutely the trend that we are seeing with our customers. So yes. Mm-hmm. Let's see. We've got about 2 minutes, so we're not going to get to everyone's questions, and I apologize. But please send additional questions to experts@learningdita.com, and we will answer questions in the last session of the event on Thursday in a Q&A with Scriptorium employees. Also check the questions module for a link to an evaluation for this session. Let me see. Could you quickly repeat the source about the 69% of CFOs? I think that was in regard to silos.
Yeah, so that is on the bibliography slides that's on there. It was a recent one from Business Insiders. I believe it was published about 2016.
Okay. And you also had a quote on simplicity. Could you briefly mention the origin of it?
So that is from the computer scientist Dijkstra. I believe it was I would get the year wrong if I were to speak about it. But his quote was in regards to, this was someone who worked with computer systems, and he understood them intuitively in a way that was revolutionary at that time. And he just had a mind for understanding things at a meta level. This quote, I admit, is something that I just found on his, I think it was on his Wikipedia page. But it was one that really spoke to me in that context, because we do see this level of this cognitive bias towards complexity, where our mind naturally thinks that if something is more complex, it must be more true, but that isn't necessarily the case. So I'm not sure if that exactly answers the question, but it's actually something I would like to go back to and read more from him.
John, I want to thank you very much for your time. It was a great presentation.